Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University. Welcome to Outrider 52, the relationship between reading and writing. We were triggered into this Outrider where we finished our last one, where Stephen King talked about the very tight and important relationship between reading and writing. And indeed, it seems very clear. Reading and writing go together like love and marriage, Morecambe and Wise. But do they? And in many ways, I would argue we shouldn't be so glib to align them so tightly and easily and quickly. And in our university system, we have a pretty problematic tendency, I would argue, to talk about academic literacies and sort of bundle reading and writing and all sorts of information literacy skills into that single phrase. And that's too simple, and it doesn't enable us to teach reading and writing and information literacy in a scaffolded, reflexive and careful way. Reading and writing, you see, are very different semiotic acts. They have a very different relationship between signifiers and signifieds, and they use corporeal literacies, so they engage bits of our senses in a very different way. If you think about it, we use our senses. Why our senses are so important is that's how we gather information. And our literacies are formed when our senses configure those relationships in innovative ways. But, and this is a very, very important but, in the higher degree space, reading and writing have a very close and a very tight relationship. In fact, I often refer to it as a very intimate relationship, a very hot relationship. And yet we don't talk about in a higher degree program the very intricate relationship between reading and writing, and also how the longitudinal data sets, the longitudinal literature is transforming how we think about their relationship. So we're going to talk about that today. You see, I'm going to tell you a really deep and difficult truth here, and you may recognize yourself here. When a student says, I'm not a very good writer, I'm a bad writer, to quote our earlier Outrider, I'm a bad writer, sometimes, and I would argue, to be frank, a lot of the time, the problem is not that they are a bad writer. The problem is that they haven't done enough reading. So the student is a poor writer because they simply don't have enough to talk about. They don't have enough to write about. You see, what's occurring in the doctoral space at the moment is we have students with very little content, very little knowledge, so when they start to write sentences and paragraphs for more formal writing exercises, it's generalised gobbledygook nonsense, or they're talking about themselves, how they feel about knowledge rather than knowledge itself. Now again, I'm doing some hard stuff with you today. I've examined the worst 10 PhDs of my entire career in the last 2 years. And those 10 theses have particular characteristics. The first is all 10 of those poor theses came from Australia. That is really something for us to think about now. But the major problem that all those 10 theses demonstrated, the singular problem, is the students had not read enough. They'd not read anywhere near enough that was required to make the argument that they were making. So the problem is I was reading this thesis and there was nothing in it. There was no knowledge, there was no content. So it was just filled with sort of vibe. And a PhD is not about a vibe. The other characteristic of these 10 really problematic theses is the students were very, very confident in their ignorance. So they didn't know what they didn't know, they didn't care what they didn't know, and they thought that what they didn't know was irrelevant and not important. And so they never had to confront the limitations that existed within their reading. So let me give you one example here, one of these really poor theses, and it was a very hot and complicated relationship as an examiner with this thesis. There was an oral exam, there was a viva, and so trying to give the student the benefit of the doubt, I asked the student during the oral examination, okay, on page 56, you talked about that you have deployed post-structuralist theories in this thesis. You didn't have any reference or footnote after that statement. So could I ask you, please, who are the 2 or 3 most influential post-structuralist theorists that have impacted on your thesis, your research, and your career as a researcher? Pretty straightforward question. Name 2 or 3, are you kidding me? And the student, unfortunately, was quite brittle in the response and said, well, I haven't prepared that question, and then started to cry. So it's clear there were some problems going on here, but she was maintaining a supposed post-structuralist approach without any references to post-structuralism, okay? Similarly, when I asked her why her model, her analytical model, came from a very minor article in 2001, and she was configuring her theorisation of governmentality from Foucault without any critique or questioning of what's happened to Foucault's theorisation in the last 15 years, particularly a recognition of his neoliberalism, she replied with absolute confidence, I have read the most important work. And when I listed the 15 theorists that had critiqued Foucault's theorisation of governmentality for use in our present, she again started to cry. This is a very, very sad story. But what's happened is a lack of reading created baggy prose, created generalisations. So we as examiners, we didn't really have anything to examine. Now, may this not be your trajectory through examination? I know what I've just said is quite frightening, and in some ways I did need to frighten you. This is real, and this is happening today, and there are many reasons why this is happening. So we need to do a diagnostic with you right at the start. Is your issue with writing, or is your issue really with reading, and your writing is problematic simply because you haven't got enough to write about? So what's occurring, and this is incredibly common now, we've got students that think they've got writing issues, but actually they've got reading issues. This is not, though, about individuals. This is not about some poor individuals that are just going, I can't be bothered, I'm not going to research. No, it's not. This is not about individuals. This is about a transformational research culture. You see, over a decade ago, in 2011, Aram and Roxa published what I think is one of the most important books in higher education studies, and it was titled Academically Adrift: Limited Learning on Our College Campuses. Now, it took and it takes great courage to step into the fray and say, you know what, our standards for teaching and learning, our standards for research training are too low. And they stated that the quality of undergraduate teaching and learning that currently exists, remember this was 2011, that currently exists is no longer just sort of expressed in tea rooms between academics. It's now a public policy employment disaster. And they did a longitudinal study that investigated the barriers to learning in our universities. They looked at the impact of students spending so much time on what they described as non-academic activities, such as drinking and socialising. But they also showed the consequences of students being underprepared before they even come into a university program. Quote, many students come to college not only poorly prepared by prior schooling for highly demanding academic tasks that are in front of them, but more troubling still, they enter college with attitudes, norms, values, and behaviours that are at odds with academic achievement. End of quote. Wow. So they summon the relatively customary argument that university students are underprepared in school and they arrive in university and they're completely out of their depth, and that's why the attrition rates are so high. Okay. But the authors then enact a knight's move. And this is the crucial analysis that we need to take on board here. They state, quote, if one is to cast aspersions on student culture that exists on college campuses today, one would do very well to focus equal attention on faculty cultures and orientations. Remembering that faculty describes academics, describes teaching and research staff in the North American system. So, blame for this lack of educational achievement was not loaded onto students. Instead, they shone a spotlight on us, on academics. Their expectations, our inability to prepare, our inability to lift students to the required standards of teaching and learning. Now, Aram and Roxa focused very strongly on the disconnection between staff and students, starting with the conventional but very correct argument that a doctoral program does not prepare people to learn how to teach. So a PhD is a PhD, very important research training. There is nothing in a PhD program that teaches you how to teach or teaches you how to supervise a PhD, full stop. So subject expertise, what Narelle Hunter, Jamie Quinton and I described as disciplinary literacies, are crucial here. But there's also another key component that's required for a successful learning environment. What about the specialist teaching and learning that exists in a doctoral program? Now, Aram and Roxa didn't really investigate supervision and the teaching that exists in a doctoral program. But think about it. What is the teaching and learning involved in what we do in a PhD? The role of teachers in student learning in our universities is highly underplayed and highly underregulated. But of course, what's happening is schools are being blamed, school teachers are being blamed. These are, apologies for that, these are all incredibly easy targets for our blame. But we must put the white light of focus on our supervisors and on the teaching and learning that is happening in our doctoral programs. So a larger and more expansive engagement with this topic is Christopher Newfield's remarkable, love this book, Understanding the Public University, a great book, I recommend it to you. He tracks what has happened to our universities in post-industrial ages. He tracks what he described as having seen through his academic career as, quote, intellectual and imaginative decline. Wow. So the failure rates that exist in our universities, the lack of preparation for students before they enter a university, and the disparities in the completion of degrees on the basis of race and gender in particular, we really need to focus on. And remember, I just always need to remind you of this, in our higher degree programs, there is a higher attrition rate for women, for older crew, for citizens of colour, Indigenous students and students with a disability. If you're one of those students, you have a higher attrition rate than any other group. Okay, so a lot is going wrong, full stop. Therefore, a deficit model of teaching and learning is maintained rather than an abundance model of teaching and learning. And I'll make the obvious point post-COVID, and this is crucial, and we're only just starting to see this now in the research and in our doctoral programs, but I've taught online since 1997. I was one of the first generation of people to teach fully online courses, okay? So I'm no Luddite, I was there at the start, I've done this. And what I've seen through my career is money being absolutely chugged into hardware and to software, and no money being placed into wetware, into professional development to improve teaching and learning, right? So the rush to get all those materials online during COVID, and it was a terrible, terrible time and a terrible, terrible experience. But the whole point was just get everything online, right? And the lack of engagement or andragogy or information literacy and scaffolding around those online materials means today we now have highly underprepared students entering our doctoral program. Very few people are talking about it. They're talking about with me as I move around the world doing keynotes and stuff in tea rooms and having a cup of coffee. But the consequences of that underpreparedness of that generation of undergraduates in a doctoral program, we are now seeing. Making my point really blunt here if I can, undergraduate students who completed their undergraduate degree during COVID, who didn't watch the online lectures, they were there, didn't bother watching them, online seminars, didn't bother switching on their camera, were sort of there but sort of weren't, they didn't learn a lot. They didn't read a lot, they didn't write a lot. They didn't complete those kitchen science projects that were sent to them. So that group has now arrived in a higher degree program. They are deeply underprepared in disciplinary literacies. They haven't read enough and they haven't written enough. And their disciplinary literacies are seriously problematic. This is true for all disciplines, can I say, but I am most worried about our colleagues that are in the lab-based sciences, studio-based or fieldwork-based methodologies. The enthusiasm for educational technology has lied to us for 25 years. To quote the legendary Coate and Allahar, they're really clear on this, and I agree with every word of this, quote, "The enthusiasm about the application of the new technologies to the university setting has clearly outpaced the empirical evidence regarding their potential to enhance academic engagement and achievement. It is clearly a curious development that so many people are willing to let technology drive curriculum rather than the other way around." End of quote. Generative AI, anyone? Their argument is incredibly important. Corporatisation, managerialism has manifested in a prioritisation of technology over a prioritisation of expertise. Reading academic materials is incredibly difficult. Reading an Instagram post is incredibly easy. Aram and Rotzka argue that the focus on access in our institutions, so all the focus in the last 20 years has been on access to higher education. Important project, I get that. But they argue that the focus on access means that there's less attention on the expectations of students once they enter our campus. And this results in students drifting through a university without any sense of intrinsic motivation, why they're participating in learning. Aram and Roxa ask a key question and then they answer it. Quote, "How much are students actually learning in contemporary higher education?" End of quote. So instead of blaming students, they're looking at us, they're looking at academics and our expectations. And they found that 50% of the students in their study had not enrolled in a single undergraduate course that required more than 20 pages of writing in a semester or more than 40 pages of reading in a week. Aram and Roxa offer a clear maxim, quote, "When faculty have high expectations, students learn more." End of quote. When higher degree supervisors have high expectations, our PhD students learn more. If students are underprepared in undergraduate education, which they are, without that expertise in methodology, epistemology and ontology, and they don't hold the disciplinary literacies and the academic literacies, if you want to use that phrase, then the standards in our doctoral program must decline. Because what's happening, team, is we as supervisors, we're spending most of the candidature trying to get students to the standard that they should have arrived with, right? So we're working, giving them the training that we used to be able to guarantee from honours or capstone programs or really strong and robust coursework master's programs. So you can see how reading and writing has really got a very, very complex relationship. But I really just want to finish off, as we're finishing off the gig this week, I want to talk about what examiners think about with regard to reading and writing and the proxy that we're looking for in that relationship. Now, remember, I read thousands of examination reports, and the quality of writing is used by examiners as a proxy for the quality of research. Full stop. If the writing is sloppy, the examiners are worried that the research is sloppy. If the writing is rushed, then examiners go very, very deep, very, very quickly to see if the research is also rushed. And the other key problem that is increasing is if examiners see too many chapters written by too many people, so again the assumption that a peer-reviewed article is a chapter, so examiners, we see so many chapters with so many people listed as authors, we have to ask the question, who wrote this thesis? And research misconduct matters emerge when we can't answer that question. And can I say this is particularly serious in the Australian system, where still 2/3 of Australian universities do not have an oral exam. All we've got is the script. So I can't ask you the questions about whether or not you know what's going on in your own thesis. It's a truism that there is a connection between what a person reads and what a person writes. And that was the Stephen King argument. I have enormous respect for that. But what is that relationship, seriously? What is this interplay? In terms of literacy theory, reading and writing are very, very different activities. We have reading involving the decoding of text, if you will. So what we do when we read is we see sort of a letter or a squiggle or something, and we see a series of squiggles, and we're able to align them into a word. So reading involves decoding squiggles. Writing is different because it involves encoding text, taking those squiggles, and we're then making meaning. And we hit a combination of keys on our keyboard, and that is the encoding of text, that is writing. But what is the relationship between decoding and encoding? Well, in antiquity, there's no doubt that the apprentice writer, remember it was a fantastic occupation to be in antiquity, but in antiquity, the apprentice writer would read. So reading was the scaffolding to being a writer. And a lot of those models started to change, like most of our educational models, through the 1960s. And this wasn't necessarily a good move, can I say. But suddenly in the 1960s, composition became a really big thing, and an independent thing from all other modes of writing. So it was about originality and expressing one's feelings and so forth. The writer's original voice. This is what was being taught through composition. So teachers, our goal was to aid your originality, your voice, your mode of expression. And so the voice of the writer became the priority. Now you'll notice that a lot of these modalities refer to fiction. And this meant that the writing of non-fiction, particularly academic writing, was underplayed and undertaught, because all the focus has been on these relatively meaningless words, empty signifiers, originality, creativity. Academic writing and academic writers sort of bumble through our prose. Who has taught you how to write as an academic? Ask yourself that question. Has anyone sat down with you and taught you what is the nature of academic writing? And if you've just sort of picked it up, where have you got that from? You see, the problem we've got is most writing, particularly in a PhD program, is not about experience. It's not about what you're feeling. It's not about your original voice. Your writing has got to be based on deep reading and deep research. And from this, if you will, sausage meat of research and reading, you can figure a whole. You can figure something meaningful based from the evidence. Without the reading, you've got nothing to put in your PhD. Full stop. The legendary Professor Steve Graham from Arizona State University conducted a fascinating study, though, where he inverted the relationship between reading and writing. So he inverted what I just did there. And he argued that students become better readers when they write more. And he enacted a very good research project to prove that. He stated, quote, "If you teach writing, you create better readers," end of quote. Agree with that too. So if we write, we improve our ability to read and research. And let me tell you why. And this is also, by the way, why I ensure that all my students write throughout their candidatures, right? From week one, they write something for me. The reason for that being, right through to the 1990s, there was that dreadful phrase, I'm writing up. So you basically didn't do any writing, and in the final 6 months, you wrote up your research. And of course, you'd basically forgotten how to write. We learn to write by writing. It's iterative. And of course, that skill had not been developed. And that, of course, resulted in some problematic theses in another way. So writing all the way through the candidature, having milestones, having writing verified and checked, is a way to keep students' hand in the writing process. Now, I've always said we learn to write by writing, and our writing improves through writing. So please keep writing. And there are lots of reasons for this strategy. The priority is it reduces stress. Because if you're writing up at the end and you know you're writing rubbish, that's incredibly stressful. But also you improve your writing through the candidature. As a supervisor team, I can't explain to you how students can start as really pretty mediocre writers and become magnificent within 3 years. And they do it by continuing to write. But as you can see by Steve Graham's research, this writing also sharpens your research capacity. So this relationship between reading and writing has been studied empirically right from early childhood education, when we see all sorts of symbols and we learn what they mean. Apple, ball, fantastic, right the way through to a higher degree where we're dealing with very, very intricate high theory and trying to create something innovative and new with it, standing on the shoulders of giants. But there is a fascinating array of theory now that is becoming a theoretical model that allows us to understand reading and writing separately, but then also carefully bring them together. And can I say, the other thing to remember, I'm doing a lot of work on this at the moment, that the nature of literacies is that we all forget how we learnt them, okay? So we actively forget the skills that were required to develop those literacies, right? So we read, we forget how we learnt to read. We write, we forget how we learned to write. We iron, we forget how we learned to iron. So skill mastery, ironically, is also about forgetting how you got there in the first place. The nature of reading and writing relationships is that they're often taught separately, and what the research is showing now is they must not be. They have an integrated developmental relationship, particularly in non-fiction and particularly for academic writing. And can I say, the relationship between reading and writing, if carefully taught, changes through time and the expertise of the student as well. Both reading and writing are language processes. And while the teaching of reading has a really large body of literature, it's a very underexplored area about how we teach someone to be an academic writer. Plenty of style guides, plenty of how-tos, but the research, the longitudinal research, is seriously undercooked. So at its most basic, we have two questions to ask of ourselves. What does reading due to writing ability? And how does writing impact on how research is undertaken? These are two great questions for our lifetime. So writing about our research summons a thinking space. Mike Wallace and Alison Ray, wonderful scholars, refer to this as critical reading. That is, we learn to build an argument through evidence. When we read, we start to see the models to configure great research and see how evidence is activated to verify our claims. But critical reading goes one step further. We interpret the research of others to develop our own research. This type of critical reading allows us as researchers to identify assumptions, so incredibly important, evaluate the evidence for statements, but also assess and reassess our reasoning. This is task or goal-driven reading. So before we read anything, I'd ask us all to do an intervention from today. Whenever we are about to read something, let's ask ourselves, why am I reading this? Why am I reading this? Why are you reading this book, this article, this conference paper? And that means we come into the reading space with critical reading configured around us. So we are motivated to understand and interpret and explore our assumptions. Crucial. We always have to remember that all of us write to be read, full stop. The goal for all of us, and what I'm desperate to help you do, is get our PhD students to move from basic textbooks and encyclopedias and rubbish, the really low level of reading, and get you to high level peer-reviewed reading as quickly as possible. It's always important to remember that we see the world and there's an intervention in how we see the world through the research that we read. And that is the gift of research. We don't sit in our experience, in our feelings, in our vibe. We explore and read the words and the worlds of others. And we then transform. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.